It's my great honor to introduce the first plenary speaker of JALT 2018, Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman. I first met Diane in 1991 when I became a Master of Arts in Teaching graduate student at the School for International Training in Brattleboro, Vermont. From the very beginning, she was open and giving of her time and extremely accessible, both on campus and then later at conferences and workshops around the world. Peace Corps volunteer in Malaysia, graduate studies at Michigan, faculty positions at UCLA, SIT, and Michigan. Diane's expertise is broad. Linguist, teacher trainer, researcher, author, administrator, mentor, editor, SLA, TESOL, chaos theory, grammarine, focus, meaning, and use, and now complex systems theory. Though if you do your research, you'll see she first published in that ever-changing area in the late 90s. To this day, I apply things that I've learned from Diane. One example being playing the believing game, a concept put forth by Peter Elbow, but as far as I'm concerned, one I learned from Diane. Given a choice of believing in an idea or doubting it, why not subject it to the discipline of belief? This will help us find hidden virtues or strengths in ideas that initially may sound wrong or even crazy. On top of all of this, many of us know Diane as the co-author of the grammar book. I have a grammar book story. Diane asked me before the plenary, "You're not going to tell that story, are you?" I said, "Well, I'd like to a little, so with your indulgence." It was the spring of 1992 in English Applied Linguistics, a pedagogical grammar course, and more. A few of us were chatting about how everything in the grammar book fits together so nicely. Diane invited us to stop talking and pay attention as a good teacher would. But Diane, we're talking about the grammar book. It's so great. Everything fits together seamlessly. She modestly told us, the grammar book doesn't cover everything. And there a seed was planted. We took a picture to show that the grammar book does cover everything. Third from the right with the white hat on, in case some of you are wondering. Okay. It gets better. A few days later, after we posed for the photo, 16 of the women in our cohort, not to be outdone, took an even more impressive photo in celebration of the grammar book and Diane. Time doesn't allow to look at that one. For that, you can look at Facebook. There's an album, The Best of SIT Map 23. Okay, to close and to get back to why we're here. There are famous people, and there are famous people's teachers. Diane fits in the intersection of those two areas. There's a saying, which I'll butcher as I'm prone to do, we are where we are today because we're standing on the shoulders of giants who have come before us. Well, whose shoulders do those giants stand on? We will hear from one of those greats today. Diane epitomizes best practices. She cares about her students and colleagues. She goes the second mile. These are some of the reasons we love her so, and they are why you'll love her too. Let's give a warm JALT welcome to my professor and friend and the co-author of the grammar book, which does cover everything that needs to be covered, Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman. And here I'm supposed to bring up this. Okay. Diane, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks so much for the introduction. You shouldn't take pride in your former students, but you can't help but do so. Shouldn't take pride in your children, but you can't help but do so. Thanks so much, Steve. Ohayo gozaimasu. It's not bad, huh? I'm very happy to be here. Of course, I have a long list of people to thank, too. I don't have the cue cards that an Academy Award winner might, but let me see if I can do my best. Thank you to Richmond for giving me the opportunity to be here. Louise Ohashi, of course, for all the work you do on our behalf and everybody's behalf. To Anne and Katrina, thank you. To George Cavacci, where is he? For giving me, being the detail person and helping me to get here and navigate coming here to be with you, and you for giving me an opportunity to be in this wonderful city with marvelous views. I've enjoyed it so far very much. Now, if I could only sleep, it would just be perfect. So I always take the theme of a conference seriously because I feel that the people who have organized the conference have given some thought to it. And to be respectful of that thought, and also because I can learn something, I've decided to talk about inclusion and diversity and inclusion. Of course, it's a very popular theme these days, popular meaning a lot of people are talking about it. And so I congratulate the organizing committee on their choice of a theme. It's an important theme. It seems that the world is an increasingly diverse place. Maybe the diversity is only in our awareness. Maybe it isn't really more diverse than it has been. I'm reminded of Stephen Veretek's coining of the term superdiversity to describe the era in which we are in, but then Aneta Pavlenko saying, well, actually, we've been diverse all along. You just haven't seen it in the parts of the world in which you live. But who can deny it? If you watch the evening news, as I do, or social media, we see every day, just as an example, thousands upon thousands of people leaving their homes to get away from violence and war, or environmental degradation, or economic challenges, to go to some other place, and bringing with them their diversity. Sadly, the diversity comes with them, but the inclusion doesn't necessarily. And that's why it's so important, I think, to have that combination, diversity and inclusion. I'm going to start off by just, I guess, seconding the theme by talking about some of the diversity issues in my own country and in Japan that I've been able to find. You know them much better than I, but I'm trying to be contextually appropriate. Or maybe not so appropriate, because some of it is bad news. But anyway, you'll see that in a moment. After that, I'm going to introduce a complex systems perspective, because that's the way I think these days. And I think complexity theory, or complex dynamic systems theory, as we are wont to call it these days, I think that it has something to say about diversity and inclusion. What lessons can we learn? And then I'll finally conclude with some suggestions for how to enhance inclusion in our classrooms, in our educational systems, and beyond, because we do have an influence, and the world needs us now, if it ever did before. Okay, so that's what I want to say by way of an introduction, a three-part talk. So diversity, inclusion, why now? I've just already explained. I think it's an important, at least awareness today of the growing diversity of the world. Again, probably always has been diverse, perhaps more than ever. We are aware of that. So in my own country, in the United States, the census has found a more diverse America as whites lag growth. Now, that explains a lot, I think, in terms of what's happening in my country. Frankly, things that are happening in my country I'm not particularly proud of. But anyway, that's another story. I don't want to go there right now. The point is that the awareness of whites lagging has now brought out all sense of fear, resistance, in some cases violence, and a growing sense of nationalism. And when we look at the school children, the blue is the white, the Caucasian children. We see that forecast for 2060, white students will actually be in the minority. And this kind of graph incites that resistance and that pushback, and in some cases, the violence that we're witnessing now, sadly. The linguistic and cultural diversity of America's school population has increased dramatically during the past decade and is expected to increase even more in the future. The concept of a minority group will soon become obsolete, as no group will be a majority. Now, it's okay to have minority groups all together, learning together. In fact, it's more than okay, it's a good involvement, I believe. But James G. makes the point that a problem arises when school-based discourses treat some minority children as other and their social practices as deviant and non-standard. What's happening also in higher education in the United States, and you may be aware of this, it's quite a famous study, or it's actually a lawsuit against Harvard showing that, or claiming that Harvard admission officers show discrimination against Asian Americans. Their response is yes, maybe, or their response is not, they don't say yes, it's a lawsuit going on right now. So they don't say anything really, but the speculation is that they do that, if they do that, because they want to further diversify their student body, and Asian Americans always do so well on the admissions tests that they tend to favor them in the admission. But I'm going to leave it in the United States now and come to Japan, and again, I mean no insult by these comments, it's just what I've been able to learn, either because it's made international news, which it has in some cases, or because I've done some investigating myself, and learned that in November last year, just a year ago, the Japan Association of National Universities decided on bringing in both privately run exams and mark sheet style tests for all test takers at the general entrance exam stage. You probably know all this, right? You know this was the idea. And then in the paper, 8 private English tests accepted for future university admission system. So the university is accepting these 8 tests. As I understand it, however, the 8 tests are problematic in the sense that not everyone has access to them, or if they choose to go where they are, it costs money. To take them costs money, and therefore someone who is socioeconomically challenged is going to have a hard time doing this, that is, taking one of these tests. Therefore, I don't know the sequence exactly, but again in March, the University of Tokyo plans to reject private English tests as an admission requirement in the interest of fairness. The Japan Times, Tokyo Medical University admits subtracting points from repeat male applicant scores and boosting others to secure donations. So if you failed the test a few times, you were actually points were subtracted, so you would fail further in order to enhance donations to the university. Is this inappropriate? I don't mean to be offensive. I just think that we need to unearth this and see what's going on. And so I hope I'm not being inappropriate. I hope I am being contextually appropriate at least. Of course, this is a very famous one. This has made the international news, and this is from just last month. The group of women is demanding compensation from the Japanese medical university that routinely altered their scores in order to keep them out. You know about this? I mean, it certainly made international news, so if you don't, I'm surprised, but who knows? The only thing I can say about this, prompting a government investigation, is that the university accepted and agreed that they had done this, that they had rejected women unduly, and they announced that they would now accept those women who had been rejected inappropriately. And I think that's interesting. This suit is interesting to me because the women are suing for something over, I think it was, what was it, 10,000 yen or something? I'm not sure. And that was interesting to me because if it was a suit in the United States, believe me, it would have been much more than 10,000 yen, something like that. Now, of course, I alluded to this earlier. This was a demonstration in Brattleboro, Vermont, a vigil actually, that I attended just before leaving to come here earlier this month. This is a newspaper article or a photo from the Brattleboro Reformer. And it was a Christian minister, and the woman in the pink to his right is the cantor of a Jewish community in Vermont. And we were coming together after the terrible episode that you may know about. There were so many these days, it's hard. But it was in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and people lost their lives while they were worshiping. Very tragically. This is what it comes to these days, this failure to acknowledge difference, or to fear it so much, and to be incited to do so by powers that be in my country. Henry Giroux, who's a public intellectual, has said last April at the American Educational Research Association, "These days are dark." And I don't want to be so somber after having such a stimulating beginning to this conference, but I feel that. I feel the days are dark in many ways, but they don't have to remain that way, and we as educators have a power to turn the light back on, or at least to let it burnish more brightly. The UNESCO put out a report that talks about diversity becoming an asset and not a threat. I bold-faced those words. Can we make diversity an asset, not a threat that leads to these violent acts and these acts of rejection that are inappropriate for the applicants? Of course, higher education is also taking up the theme, for sure. My own university has a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan. And they make the point in it that excellence in education, excellence is not possible without diversity in the broadest sense of the word. Diversity can include disability. SIT Graduate Institute, October is Disability Awareness Month. Diversity includes disability. Again, Michigan had a suit brought against it for what's called affirmative action, providing members of certain minority groups extra points in their application in order to provide more balance in the student body and give those students who are underprivileged a leg up in the admissions process. And they made the point in their amicus brief that diversity in academic institutions is essential to reaching students, to teaching students the human relations and analytical skills they need to thrive and lead in the work environment of the 21st century. So it's not just a question of parity, it's a question of enhancing education for everybody. Higher education, this clearly has caught on, at least nominally. I noticed just before I came, the University of North Texas has a new position, Assistant Professor of Literacy and Anti-Racist Education. That's the title of a new position. I thought that was interesting. At Penn, they're looking for an associate director for their Center for Teaching and Learning. And notice the Center for Teaching and Learning seeks an associate director who will specialize in supporting inclusive and equitable teaching. So again, at least in terms of what we say in higher education, what we say as educators, it seems that we're going in the right direction. Not just in America, not just in Japan. I was at a conference last winter, in Thessaloniki, Greece, and this gentleman gave a paper on the impact of classroom activities in the improvement of the students with ADHD reading skills. So it seems to me these themes are transcendent. I said in my abstract for this conference, it's often the fear of diversity that fuels many of our conflicts in our world today. And President Amy Gutmann of the University of Pennsylvania, in a keynote address in September, said, "What higher education does to strengthen diversity and inclusion, in turn, strengthens the world far beyond our campuses." That's why I say we have a role to play, an important role to play, in helping to go beyond our campuses in the theme of diversity and inclusion. Okay, so that's what I hope to do by setting the stage for now turning to complex systems and saying, how can we understand diversity from a complex systems perspective? Now, I'm not going to take you through the whole complex systems literature or characteristics. This is not the time to do so. I am, if I'm allowed to say this, going to do a featured talk tomorrow afternoon on complexity theory, so if you're interested, I'll say a lot more there. But I'm going to talk about complex systems from the perspective of diversity and inclusion. And first note that a complex system, such as an economy or a tropical ecosystem, consists of interacting adaptive entities that produce dynamic patterns and structures. Complex systems often prove robust to internal and external disturbances. This robustness emerges even though it is neither engineered from the top down nor an objective of the parts, from the book by Scott Page. And so the two pictures here on the left, of course, is a tropical rainforest. On the right is a what do we call it, a mono-product agricultural plot. And which do you think is the more robust, which is likely to withstand degradation or attacks from the environment? Which one, the right or the left? Yeah, on the left, because there's diversity, right? There's enough in there that's varied and diverse to keep the system going if it's attacked by pestilence or drought or that sort of thing. On the right, all you need is one thing that affects that crop, and you lose the entire crop unless you can do some kind of defense at the moment. There was an interesting display, again at Michigan, called Red Rock and Rust Belt, A Tale of Two Cities. Again, from Scott Page, diversity often enhances the robustness of complex systems. Systems that lack diversity can lose functionality. And I haven't defined system for you, but if you think, here, this example, I gave you the example of the agricultural system or the ecological system of a rainforest and a mono-product. What's the word for that? A monocrop agriculture, there's a word for it. Anyway, that. Here's another system, the system of a city. Notice on the left is Petra, the beautiful city in Jordan. On the right is a picture from Detroit, Michigan. Both of those cities lost their, almost lost everything because Petra rested on trade, and Detroit, Michigan, on the auto industry. And when both of those soured, they had nowhere to go. And Detroit really was in ruins. They didn't have any kind of resilience. They had nothing to fall back on. I mean, they had other industries, of course, but the automobile industry was so dominant that when that failed, everything kind of collapsed. And they're rebuilding now, and lots of people are talking about the bright future of Detroit, but they went through a very difficult time. Petra, too. Petra lost its trade, and apparently, this is what we understand, it too went into oblivion. In order for a system to be successful over time, it needs more variety than would be considered essential at any time. This is not only so that a system is able to comprehend its environment, but also so that it is able to react to ever-changing or new environments. Another thing about complex systems is it's dynamic. They are dynamic. And they are dynamic internally, but also in the way in which they interact with the ever-changing environment external to them. Identity diverse groups perform better than homogeneous groups. With routine tasks, not so much, but with problem-solving tasks, there is evidence for this hypothesis. Again, from my colleague Scott Page's book, Diversity and Complexity. And he says, diversity allows people to do what they do best. What a resounding endorsement that is. Uh-oh, lots of words, I'm sorry, but these are my words and you get kind of attached to them, you know? Let's see if I can do this for you. CDST, Complex Dynamic Systems Theories, offers a different way of thinking. It's an ecological theory. It recognizes not only the interdependence of the elements that comprise a complex system, but also that any system itself does not operate in a vacuum. It, too, is independent with other systems, creating a moving tapestry of interacting systems, and out of the interaction of the components of complex systems, a new, often unexpected regime of order emerges. I'm sorry for all the words. I'm really grateful to the drum team because that got you up anyway. I'm trying not to put you to sleep. Maybe I should borrow some sticks and see if I can get going here. So let's just pause for a moment and ask ourselves, what do we mean by diversity? I've used the word, you used the word, I've used it several times already this morning. What do we mean by diversity? Well, that's interesting in itself because different groups have come forward at different times in history to claim that they are being discriminated against and to fight for their rights, right? So we have race, still an issue, of course, but nonetheless, that's one of the issues that comes to mind most immediately. Ethnicity, language diversity, students with learning differences, first-generation college students, people who have their parents have not gone to college before, and I understand there are more and more of those coming into Japanese universities now as the population dwindles. the population of applicants dwindles. More and more first-generation college students who don't necessarily have the same preparation as others are coming in. Gifted learners, those with interrupted schooling. I'm thinking here of people who are fleeing their countries and for some time residing in refugee camps or elsewhere, and their children are not getting school. They finally do go to school, but their schooling was definitely interrupted with a deleterious effect. Homeless students, gender, of course, a gender difference. Did you notice the diversity in this group here, by the way? The drumming group? You were here this morning, right? There was this drumming group. And I couldn't help but notice the diversity. At least 3 obvious ways that the group was diverse. Did you see that? Anyway, gender was one of them. Gender identity and expression. Age, painfully aware of this one these days. Sexual orientation. Disability, interesting there. On 2 flights I've taken recently, one here, they normally let passengers with disabilities board first, right? They give a call. Any passengers with disabilities are welcome to pre-board. Does that sound familiar? But I heard on a flight, not the one here, but the one right before it, I heard the announcement, disabled passengers are welcome to pre-board at this time. And I got thinking, so here's another wonderful grammar question, right? What's the difference? I won't answer it for you, but you can answer it for yourselves, I'm sure. What's the difference with passengers with disabilities, disabled passengers, right? It makes a difference how we use words. Words can empower, words can disempower. Okay, income, SES, religion. I heard, and then there's 16, I don't even see it, 16 ... because there's so many more. I mean, I think sizeism, you know, I'm not diminutive, is a way to put it. And sitting on the economy seat in my airplane, like this, and the gentleman, or the man, in front of me put his seat back, and of course I was working on my computer, so I'm typing like this. You know, that seems to be another category we haven't yet addressed in terms of diversity and inclusion. But there's so many others. You know, international students in Japan, for instance, might be a group. Yeah, and I had another one in mind that just escaped. These are things I've learned since I've come here. What was the other group? Sorry, it's gone from me now in my jet lag state. But another group in Japan that perhaps doesn't get a lot of play, but in fact exists as a group that seems to be a minority and perhaps is affected in a negative way because of that. Folks who aren't thinking critically about this imagine that diversity ends at demographics. They say we want people who look different from us, but who act just like we do. And I thought that was very telling. Really, one of the lessons from a complex systems perspective is that its parts are non-finite. We'll always define ourselves in terms of alterity, in terms of difference. That is, there's always going to be something between me and you that's going to make us different. Always there'll be. And we'll get down to smaller and smaller and smaller portions, but that's always the way we'll define ourselves. Difference, of course, doesn't mean a negative thing, but that is in fact the case. It only becomes negative when there's discrimination on the basis of that difference. Of course, we have to be careful not to use essentialist categories, which easily lead to stereotyping. In commenting, Ariba Jibril, a UM student, said, "Diversity is speaking for myself without being seen as the spokesperson for all individuals who share my identities." I like that a lot, right? It's easy to stereotype. It's easy to say, oh, she's a woman, or oh, she's older, or something like that, and ascribe. Then we interact with them differently as a result of having labeled them with a particular label or labels. Again, Amy Gutman in the SOFIN forum last February, when we categorize people, we lose sight of their humanity. At its core, immigration is about the fate of millions of individual people, refugees, migrants, disabled people, DACA recipients, as are young people who were brought to the United States as children, by their parents who are illegal. Yes, but individuals with lives and families. When we talk about immigrants, or we talk about gay people, or we talk about older people, senior citizens if we want to be politically correct, we tend to treat them in a certain way, and we see them as a category, ignoring the intra-category differences among them. Oh, I guess I just said this. We need to problematize the assumption that individuals are categorizable while disregarding their intra-category differences, and thus Evan Thompson, a philosopher, and thus changing how we interact with them and how they think of themselves. We give them a label, and we treat them with that label. Complex systems operate on many different levels. So this is a research project that I conducted in 2006, looking at the complexity, the increasing accuracy, fluency, vocabulary complexity, and grammatical complexity of a group of Chinese learners of English, intermediate level, at the ELI at the University of Michigan. I'm not going to take you through all the mechanics of this issue. I'm happy to give you the citation if you're interested. But basically, the charts represent, the graphs represent change over time. And if you were the teacher of this group of students from June to November, about a 6-month period, how would you feel about this class? Would you feel good? Did they make progress from June to November? Did they? Sure they did. Sure they did. They learned something. They're at a different place in November on these 4 metrics. I know I didn't give you very much information about these, but these 4 measures, they improved. There was a dip in August on 2 of them, but everyone dips in August, don't they? So that's not so bizarre. The point is that they did well. They improved in a 6-month period on these measures after having intensive instruction. But complex systems operate in different levels of scale. So if we leave the group level and look at the individual level, what do you think we get? We get spaghetti. We get ups and downs. This is inter-individual, so comparing one individual to another. The darker line is the average, but look, no one person actually aligns with the average. They all have their individual trajectories of development. And if we look at within the learner now, not across learners, but within the learner, the intra-individual variation, again, we see the nonlinearity of learning. It does not conform to a linear upward trajectory. Of course, there are patterns. It's not just all mush. When we compared grammatical complexity to vocabulary complexity, we saw that people on the left were more committed to working on their grammatical accuracy. The one on the left worked more on fluency, on vocabulary complexity, and that same learner worked more on fluency, whereas the learner with the pink boxes worked more on grammatical complexity. So there are patterns. I'm not saying it's just, it just disappears at another level, but you have to tease it apart. It's not the pattern of the average. And so traditional models often assume that insights about the population automatically apply to all individuals. This assumption is simple, it's understandable, and it's necessary to justify the use of averages to understand individuals. However, it's also wrong. Let me say that again. We take group measures and we say, these students or these people are like that, and it doesn't have to be derogatory. But the point is that it talks at the group level, not the individual level. And I just showed you the individual level is very, very different. The traditional Gaussian bell-shaped way of looking at the world begins by focusing on the ordinary and then deals with exceptions, or so-called outliers as ancillaries. But there's a second way, which takes the exceptional as a starting point and treats the ordinary as subordinate. I like that. Takes the exceptional as the starting point and treats the ordinary as subordinate. If variability is systematically ignored, individuals become synonymous with statistical averages. Instead, individual variability is the essence of adaptive behavior. From a complex systems perspective, categories can change. Here are some examples from nature. A female ant larva can become a queen or a worker, depending on the food she's been given. A turtle can develop into a male or female, depending on the temperature at a critical point in its incubation. Interesting, huh? A wrassafish can become a male or female, depending on whether there's a male already resident in the reef. And species can adapt. If an ecosystem contains too few male groupers, the largest female grouper becomes a male. We think of these categories as being so discrete, but in fact they can change from nature. But what about humans? Of course, some things don't change. I guess race doesn't, but certainly attitudes towards it can change. And in humans, I thought this was a very interesting show that I listened to, well, this was 2 years ago. Tillett Wright set out to photograph gay and trans people and found that people from older generations identified super strongly with labels. Gay, for instance. The older generation liked using gay to describe themselves because they had to fight so hard for that. But younger folks were more fluid. Yeah, I loved a guy and now I love a girl and maybe I'm more boyish tomorrow. They are more fluid on a spectrum of things. We are all completely different. And I love this, frankly. The most dignified gift you can give anybody is the right to change. That's from Tillett. Right. I won't read all of this at you, but this was just earlier this year in the Science Daily. How instruction changes brain circuitry with struggling readers. So we know something about the brain's architecture and that may determine who has trouble with reading, which children have trouble reading, including dyslexia. But teaching can change that circuitry, a new University of Washington study finds. So these categories do not have to endure. They can be changed. The brain is plastic. We know that. A complex system is holistic. To isolate one part of it and to segregate it is to alter it. We have to have a whole vision. How you do that from a practical point of view is another question. I can talk about that more tomorrow, perhaps. But it's holistic as opposed to atomistic, rather than just looking at one part. So in every school, students are labeled for a variety of reasons to better serve the students, usually. But look at the last one, the last bullet there. However, the labels may serve to ostracize, to segregate, or otherwise provide a disservice to our students. We should carefully consider the labels we use and how they actually help or potentially harm the students we work with. So labels are intended to help, and maybe they do. We do talk in categories. I'm not saying we don't, but how we use them is really important. And then this from the Society for Disability Studies. The assumption that disability is a primarily biophysical phenomenon consisting of a deficit condition. And then the last one, the assumption that diagnosed or labeled individuals should be separated from the mainstream. And of course, integration versus separation is an ongoing debate about all kinds of difference. Separating, this is a TESOL course that's going on right now. It's called Separating Difference from Disability with English Language Learners. The needs of diverse learners are not being appropriately addressed when difference is used to disproportionately place diverse learners in speech pathology services and special education, or when students from diverse backgrounds are denied special services when they have limited English proficiency. So these are tall orders for us as educators to be aware of, to be sensitive to. But we can try. But we can try. A complex dynamic system perspective requires that all behavior be analyzed in the context where it occurs. Behavior is not something that a person has. Instead, it emerges from interactions between the individual and his or her context and experience. So divide these four into two groups. This may be too US-centric, but you should know some of these names. Well, Gerald Ford, president. Jodie Foster was an actress or a performer, I should say. George H.W. Bush, president. Madonna is a performer. Can you divide them into groups? Into two groups? What's a group? One group? Yeah, male, female, right? We have two males, two females. Another group? Yeah, so you have political people and people who are performers. That's a second group. Anything else? Just a second, you're ahead of me. I thought you were going to say. Okay, you can say it now. Older and younger, I thought you would come up with age, right? Of course, Gerald Ford's no longer with us, but he was 96, I think, when he passed on. Who said Michigan? Yes. So this is the point, that you grow up in different cultures, you create different piles. Not everyone in the same culture, of course, changes the same thing. But Gerald Ford and Madonna, and I'm not sure I claim pride in this, but anyway, they are alumni from the University of Michigan. Whereas Jodie Foster and George H.W. Bush both went to Yale. Now, why is that important? The point is that our experience affects how we categorize people, how we see them, right? And unless you were part of the alumni group at one of these institutions, you might not know that. So our experience does it. Here's the point. Attributes such as race shape our experiences. They limit, steer, and even guide our choices. Thus, identity attributes cause us to construct different sets of cognitive tools. When I was researching this talk, I came across a whole lot of useful resources. So I just included 5 of them on this slide. The book to the right, Judith Corbett's book, is brand new, but the others are also very valuable. A British Council publication. And then last March at TESOL, there was a group coming together to propose a new SIG, one that supports students with disabilities. So they just had a networking session last March, but they're going to propose a new SIG. One particularly valuable source I found was from Oxford University Press, entitled, it's available online. It was a position paper that they commissioned to look at inclusive practices in English language teaching. So in the next few slides, I have some quotes about that I thought were pretty important. An ethos of inclusion is one in which all students are valued. Inclusion respects the fact that people are different, that each individual experiences learning in their own way, and that everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses. And they talk about SEBD students, they talk about neurodiversity, recognizes that specific learning difficulties are part of human variation. They distinguish equality from equity. So equality is one size fits all, but if we practice equity, we're trying to ensure that each student is provided with what they need. So 2 caveats. One is that teachers are diverse too. We don't want to forget that. They have expectations, roles, etc. The other caveat is that teachers can become very weary. They can become exhausted if they're trying to fulfill their responsibilities to all of their students with these diverse needs. So let's now go to, the next slide is just really to show you, in a systems approach, teachers should not have to do it alone, right? It's not just the teacher in the classroom dealing with all this diversity. And one of the things you would hope for is that your administrators have some sense of what you're coping with and have some ideas. And so I was heartened by this announcement recently of a conference upcoming in December on leadership strategies for advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So now I'm on to my suggestions, and these come from a complexity theory perspective, but I think a lot of them are probably commonsensical to you all. First, we have to start by recognizing our own implicit biases. Steve Martin, the comedian, said, "Boy, those French, they have a different word for everything." And I thought that was a nice way to encapsulate the idea of implicit biases. We all have them. It's nothing to be ashamed about, but we want to recognize that we have them. Implicit bias is a powerful explanation for the persistence of many social inequities. And we can address those biases, or at least think about them in the classroom. We can ask ourselves, who do I call on and how often? How do I seat students or group them? Do I truly value the difference among my students, and if so, how? Do I have the same expectations for all my students? These are questions I think we can ask ourselves in order to combat implicit bias. I don't have time to do this in detail, but just last month, an Applied Linguistic Forum article published by TESOL talks about silence in a Japanese context, and I thought, oh, I can use that. And the silence in a Japanese context, the idea that silence means something different to Japanese than it might to their Western language teachers, and how to be respectful of that while still honoring one's own pedagogical approach. Deborah Lowenberg-Ball, who was president of the ERA last year, but she gave the presidential address in April, talked about teaching is dense with discretionary moments. I love that. Teaching is dense with discretionary moments. Think about it. Who should I call on? Should I wrap up now or should I do something later? Should I end the class? Should I introduce a new point? Do they have it or do they not have it? Who should I ask to come to the board? Who should I ask to stay seated? I think you can resonate, can you not, with those questions? Every lesson has tens and hundreds of discretionary moments where we have to make a decision about what to do next. And Deborah says, we have the power of teaching to disrupt racism and promote justice by developing a repertoire of practices in ways that counter normalized practice. Just taking that moment to reflect before making that decision, that nanosecond before making a decision. Cultivate humility. I remember in 2003, I gave a lecture, a talk, and I was sort of poo-pooing grammar drills that were repetition. And afterwards, Elsa came up to me, and I have her permission to report this, I've written about it, came up to me and said, you know what? I love boring repetition drills. I like them because they're so focused on one point, and if I get bored, I just pretend that the people in the drills are friends of mine, and I give them characteristics of my friends. I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? Here I am saying we shouldn't use boring repetition drills, and here's a student, a very good language learner, by the way, who loves them. Keeps you humble when you find students like Elsa. Don't set low expectations. We know the self-fulfilling prophecy. George Bush, believe it or not, was the one who talked about soft bigotry. Appreciate the outliers for what they can contribute. Dick Allwright had a person who he gave the pseudonym called Igor. And Igor was very extroverted. He was a student in a class, very extroverted. Igor was not the best student, but the students around him benefited greatly by having Igor as their classmate, because he would attract the students' attention, the teacher's attention, excuse me. The teacher would come over and do some coaching, and they would hear that by eavesdropping and learning about what was going on. So it's nice to have an outlier, maybe like Igor, as your classmate. Ask students for feedback. Observe them. Let them show you. Marjorie Rosenberg, the former president of IATEFL, said, you know, have the students come up with their own strategy. In Vermont, where I come from, we still have one-room schoolhouses where older children coach younger children learn from each other and from their older peers. Maybe we need to have more opportunities for that. Think in terms of universal design. This universal design for learning is an approach that minimizes barriers and maximizes learning for all students. This was an IATEFL webinar that I listened to because of you, because I knew I was coming here last March, and where she talked about dealing with students who are different. This is a dormitory from Gallaudet University, a university of the deaf, just in Washington or outside of Washington. It's a new dormitory. It was a couple of years ago. If you look at the design, it looks rather nondescript, right? A brick building, nothing particularly special about it. But when you go inside, you see that there are all kinds of accommodations for the deaf that actually help everybody. Things like glass walls at the stairway. So if you're signing and you turn to go up the next tier of stairs, you lose the conversation if there's a wall there, right? But if it's glass, you can continue the conversation because, of course, it's transparent and you can see the signing that's continuing. But there are all kinds of other accommodations. And the architect said, this isn't about accommodating. Well, I just said it was accommodation, but he didn't say that. It's actually about using the deaf experience as a challenge to make better space for all. That's the universal design. I just have a couple more. Build the capacity of teachers and strengthen educational systems to create inclusive classrooms. Professional training for language teachers to build institutional resilience. And with students with learning differences, and this is not my specialty, but I told you I attended a webinar, and here's another one, an earlier one. Not a problem, that is, learning differences are not a problem according to Anne Margaret Smith, just a different way of perceiving the world, processing information, and interpreting sensory input. So she says, break the task into chunks, recap, review, and revise frequently. And I talk about iteration, not repetition, going around again and again, but changing it a little bit each time. I talk about teaching adaptation, teaching students to take their language resources and mold them to a changing situation. And then, of course, explicit instruction has a role, pointing out how language works can help students who have learning differences. Multisensory input, engage all channels and help them become aware of their own strengths. This is Anne Margaret Smith's advice. It seems to me that this is what we need to do. We need to show the many different, we need to take something we're teaching and show it from many different angles and perspectives. That's going to help all learners, not just those with learning differences. Now, in conclusion, what is our personal reward besides that it's a good thing to do? And I just said, I think one gains some humility and with it learning. I had a student at SIT once tell me that you could put two true modals together. You could say he might could go. I said, no, come on, you can't do that. You could say he might be able to go, but you can't say he might could. But sure enough, you can say he might could if you come from a certain dialect region in the southeastern part of the United States. So I think you learn some humility by being open to the diversity. One learns about oneself. Defining myself means finding in myself something which is significantly different from others. To exist as an individual means not simply to be numerically distinct from other things, but to be a self-pole in a dynamic relationship with alterity, with what is other, and with the world. Then Maggie Kubanijova in August in Finland, language learning might be understood as learning to encounter the other and be transformed through that encounter. I don't have time for this quote, but I want to make the point that to complexity theory, Rika talks about the relational aspect of teaching and learning. And I think this is really interesting. We say teachers need to learn their students in order to be more effective in the classroom. And that's no doubt true. But he says, actually, a complexity approach suggests not only that they should learn their students, but it also requires that teachers be transformed by their students as a result of the mutual influence by teachers and students. That it's a mutual influence, a mutual transformation. And that's something I've been trying to work on ever since getting that. Help students tell their stories. Oops, they're out of order. Create affordances from which all learners can learn. And finally, if we cannot end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. That was a statement from JFK, a commencement address at American University. And finally, because it is so magnificent, I woke up yesterday morning and I saw this from my hotel room. And thank you for listening.